You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
Good morning, everyone, or good evening if you are in Papua New Guinea or in the Autonomous Region of Bougainville. My name is Gordon Peake. I am the Senior Advisor on the Pacific Islands at United States Institute of Peace. I normally do these events solo, but I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague Camilla Poli, Senior Program Specialist at USIP, and someone who's had a long-standing and keen interest in the Pacific Islands in general and in the topic today. So Camilla, it's great to have you, and it's great to have one person with us in person and one person hopefully joining us online very, very soon. The person in person here is Kevin Pullen. Kevin Pullen is a doctoral student at the Australian National University, and he's someone who has multiple experiences working on the issue that we're talking about today, about sustaining peace in Bougainville. Kevin was Senior Advisor to the former Chief Secretary of Bougainville, and he was also Senior Advisor to two Chief Secretaries of Papua New Guinea, so you've been able to see the angle in multiple ways, and you've been in a lot of the rooms where it has happened. And with a wing and a prayer, I hope to be joining us soon is former President James Tanis, former President of the Autonomous Region of Bougainville, presently Bougainville's international legate. His job is to drum up interest in Bougainville and Bougainville's campaign for independence. I want to say a little bit about who we are at the United States Institute of Peace before we begin. We are a national, non-partisan, independent institute that was established by Congress, and we work on trying to foster and create a world where peace is possible. And we work with governments and civil societies all over the world to try to work together in order to foster peace. We work at multiple levels. If you go on our website, you can see about our work in Papua New Guinea. We also do research and analysis, and we conduct events like this today in order to try to expand our knowledge on issues like Bougainville. Let me just sort of set the scene before I turn it over to you, Camilla. It's coming on to 5 years now when myself and former President Tanis sat in a packed room inside Buka, the administrative capital of the Autonomous Region of Bougainville, awaiting the results of the non-binding referendum on Bougainville's future. Kevin, you were you'd been involved in, and were instrumental in a lot of the lead up to that, but you were following proceedings from Port Moresby, yep, if I remember correctly. And you could have heard a pin drop in that hall in December 2019. And I can remember that whenever the result was declared, 97.7% of people voting in favor of independence in this non-binding referendum. There was quiet. Then there was cheers, and then a lot of the women that were in the room broke out in a hymn of praise. We are here to talk about what's happened next. The peace agreement provides that the two governments must consult about the referendum result. But looking at it from afar, you get a sense that there's been some meetings, there's been some activity, but that the ball hasn't perhaps moved as far as we'd like to, as perhaps those in the room that day thought that it was. Bougainville is very adamant about its position on independence, that the 97.7% vote for independence means a vote for an independent nation. And Papua New Guinea seems less anxious to kind of address the issue as much as Bougainville does. And Kevin's here with us. We're hoping that James gets online soon. But what I might do at this point is pause and tell you a little bit about how the event is going to run. So Camilla and myself are going to pose some questions to Kevin and to James. But we're really, really gratified by the huge amount of interest that there is in this event, and we know that there's lots of expertise that is registered online and are listening in and watching with us. So we'd invite you to pose your own questions, your own perspectives to Kevin and hopefully to James. Our colleague Megan here is with us in the studio, and you'll be hearing her voice at about the 45 minute mark with some of your questions. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, for taking the time out of your day or your evening. Camilla, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Gordon, and thank you, Kevin, for joining us, and James, who will hopefully be joining us soon. Kevin, I'll start you off with the first question. As Gordon mentioned, the Autonomous Region of Bougainville held a non-binding independence referendum in 2019 that resulted in 97.7% of voters voting yes to independence. And since then, the two governments have been holding consultations on the result. Can you give us a brief synopsis of what has happened since 2019?
Yeah, thank you, Camilla. As Gordon said, the referendum was held in December 2019, and that resulted in 97.7% of eligible Bougainvillians voting for independence. It kind of came at a time when the world was just about to embark upon a period of quite significant change and challenges. And so the referendum concluded in December 2019, and there was a general agreement between the two governments that they would commence the consultations in the early part of 2020. And as we know, 2020 saw the advent of COVID-19. And so really that first year following the consultations was a year of significant challenges for both governments, where they were primarily focused on the health emergency that presented at the time. We also saw in the latter part of 2020 the election of a new president in Bougainville, Ismail Tarama, who took over from the former president, John Momis, who had been in power for 10 years. So it really wasn't until the end of 2020, a good 12 months after the referendum had taken place, that the two governments were really in a position to start talking about the next steps. 2021 was a year of quite significant activity. We saw 3 post-referendum consultations. The first took place in Kokopo in East New Britain in May 2021, was followed by a second consultation in Wabag in Enga province in July 2021, and concluded at the end of the year with a consultation in Port Moresby in December 2021. The May consultations were really focused about just reaffirming commitments to the process. The two governments talked about their desire to mutually work together to try and find a lasting solution consistent with the provisions contained in the peace agreement. The consultations in Wabag kind of took that a little bit further, and there was talks around timeframes and, indicative, processes that could take place as we move forward with the process. But it was really the December 2021 consultation when some, runs were made on the board, so to speak, in terms of some clear commitments on the two governments. And it was there that a document called the Erekone Covenant was signed, or was agreed to. It was signed in the early part of the next year. But that agreement essentially stated that the two governments committed to working towards developing a proposal to take to the National Parliament for consideration by 2023, and obviously that date has passed and that hasn't happened. But the other critical date that was contained in that document was that the two governments agreed that whatever the outcome, whether it be independence or another form of political settlement, that they would look to start implementation by 2025 and no later than 2027. What we've found since then is there's been a lot of discussion around the technical aspects of the requirements under the Constitution to bring the referendum result to Parliament. The Constitution is very clear that the decision-making or ratification process in relation to the referendum result rests solely with the Parliament of Papua New Guinea. And I think what we've seen, particularly over the last couple of years, is a lot of discussion around the mechanisms, things like voting thresholds, and awareness and how this will be brought before the Parliament. But that's probably been at the expense of some of the more practical discussions around what a long-term political settlement might mean. And just to finish up on the question, so most recently the two governments have agreed to appoint a new moderator to assist the two governments with the process. And I think that that's a really critical step and provides an opportunity as we move forward to start looking at some of the practical aspects around what form a future political settlement for Bougainville might take.
Yeah, because you read it from read these stories from afar, and that sense of it being very technical and process oriented and kind of what's the meaning of this word and what's the very precise step-by-step nature of the process seems to be foremost in people's minds over these very kind of real questions of how do you arrange a new set of relationships, whether it be the relationships in the form of a divorce or in the form of a separation or in the form of whatever form it might take. So I think that's a really important point to kind of focus on. In some ways, actually focusing on the technicalities is the easy part.
Absolutely.
It's actually focusing on the details, things like if Bougainville had a separate status, what would happen to the pensions of Bougainvillians? Would Bougainville need a new phone network? How would it work like that? So I think that's a really important point as well. Just for this benefit of our audience, I mean, this is live TV in a lot of extents, and we're still struggling to get James on the line, which is kind of illustrative in some ways of the technical challenges of being in the autonomous region of Bougainville. It's a place where electricity is not by no means guaranteed. It's a place where internet is haphazard at best, and so we're struggling our way through that. So I'll apologize if I look at my phone occasionally to try to get an update on that. But let's proceed, and you know for yourself from working in Papua New Guinea and Bougainville how much you just need to roll with the punches. So we'll do that. So Kevin, it's been great to have you here with us in Washington, D.C. Your arrival coincided with the last few days of a visit by senior Papua New Guinean leaders to Washington, D.C. The Deputy Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea was here. The leader of the House, who also serves as the Minister of Police, was here. The Minister of Higher Education was here. The Minister of Defense was here. A senior governor in the government was here. Illustrative of how Papua New Guinea is getting more and more attention by the international community, including the United States. And it strikes me that Papua New Guinea has a lot of priorities now. And I'd love to kind of ask you, where is Bougainville in that priority list? Is it number 1? Is it number 10? Is it number 100? And is it something that they are kind of actively and practically focused upon?
Well, look, I mean, it's hard to say where it sits within the broader priorities within PNG. As we all know, Papua New Guinea, which is an incredibly beautiful, vibrant, diverse nation, faces a number of challenges. Certainly the Prime Minister has said on a number of occasions that he regards Bougainville as being the most significant issue that faces the nation. And, that is rightly so, because how things progress and what takes place next can have significant bearing on the PNG state. I think that there is this perception that perhaps from some in the international community and outsiders that the government of PNG perhaps doesn't take this matter seriously. But certainly from my experience working within government and supporting the Chief Secretary to government, it is something that consumes many hours of his days. But the reality is it's a very complicated process, and it's not just simply a matter of taking the referendum result and putting that before the Parliament. It's about considering a whole range of complexities about what that will mean for a future Papua New Guinea and what that will mean for a future Bougainville in terms of its own capacity to be able to manage its affairs, to build strong institutions, and to generate an economic base to position it to be able to have a prosperous future. So I think it is a very significant priority for the government of Papua New Guinea, but I also think that it's often for us from a Western perspective, there's this kind of impatience that, you've had a referendum, why aren't you making a decision? And we need to remember that this is a Papua New Guinean and Bougainville problem, and it is a problem that they will work through together, and they do that in a very Melanesian way. And that's not possibly how we might do it in the Western world as we go through, statecraft and negotiations and the like. But things are happening. And I think it will continue to be a priority. And hopefully now, as I said, with the moderator being appointed, that'll provide an opportunity for the two governments to gain some traction in talking about some of the practical things that can be done.
Thank you, Kevin. I'll ask you the next question. We're just going rapid fire. I'm hoping that James will be able to connect. So The next question I'll ask you is, as Bougainville looks to become an independent state, independence really means, in practical terms, being recognized as independent by other countries. Yep. And one of the factors that seems to be critical in the ability of new nations to actually become independent states is being recognized by one of the members of the Security Council.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what is Bougainville doing, or what has it been doing, to try to get that international support from other countries like the United States, noting that Taurama did visit Washington last year?
Yeah. Look, I mean, and it's so unfortunate that we don't have former President Tanis on the line, and hopefully he's going to join us, because he'll be able to speak, I think, in a lot more detail about the Bougainville government's international strategy. I do think that, obviously the President visited the United States last year. He also visited China last year, although that was predominantly a trade visit. It wasn't a political visit. And he's certainly been reaching out, particularly within the region, amongst our Melanesian partners and Australia. I do think that there is the capacity for Bougainville to kind of internationalise their cause significantly more. I think, for the United States, it's very much on the radar. I think people are aware of what is happening in Bougainville and what the challenges are. But I think, from an international perspective, it's also that very careful balance of, Papua New Guinea is an independent sovereign state. It is a member of the United Nations. And I think, international partners have to proceed with a degree of caution in terms of the level of support and the commentary that they may make on this particular subject. You're right, absolutely. I mean, we've seen in the past Bougainville has had 2 unilateral declarations of independence. Correct me if I'm wrong, Gordon. It might be 3 very soon. But as you say, neither of those UDIs had any success, because ultimately, to become an independent nation, you need to have international recognition, and that predominantly requires becoming a member of the United Nations and having the support of the P5 and the large majority of the Assembly. So I think in terms of future international recognition, it would be something that would only be forthcoming if the 2 governments are able to mutually agree on a way forward. I think anything such as a UDI or otherwise would be taken seriously, but would have to be balanced against other obligations that partners have with the government of Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, I mean, I think this international recognition is a really important point, because, I mean, I spent the early portion of my career in Timor-Leste, which was a place that had a 9-day independence in 1975, but was sort of condemned to the graveyard of nations for 25 years, but got resurrected again through a referendum in 1999. But one of the major reasons why the referendum result was eventuated into Timor-Leste becoming once again recognized as part of a member of the Community of Nations was because there was important states that were backing it. Yep. So the United States was one of the states that was backing Timor-Leste. Australia did a 180 in its policy towards Timor-Leste, and I think that's a really important factor. I think it's worth kind of underscoring, which is the importance of recognition, because that's the X factor here. It's not necessarily the size of the referendum result, or the amount of people that voted in the referendum, or even how good or bad the governance is of a place, but it's that international recognition as well. And I think you're right. Like, there's been these kind of toes in the water in terms of sort of presidential visits, but I mean, I think this we're facing at the minute is a kind of example of a case in point, which is like very challenging even to get access from Bougainville to the outside world as well. So I'd love to know. Let's sort of maybe look through sort of scenarios here, which is, you mentioned the moderator, and I know Camilla's keen to find out, to talk more about that. She's been tracking the issue and following it closely, but you've almost got two irreconcilable positions here, which is you've got Bougainville saying independence, independence, and you've got Papua New Guinea sort of, what's the diplomatic term, like lukewarm about the idea, or kind of like maybe not as enthused about it as Bougainville is. All peace agreements end in compromise in some fashion, some form of political settlement that is managing to kind of accommodate different positions. I mean, what are the compromise options? Because you've got, at one level you've got independence, at another level you've got don't want to give you independence, but there's a kind of messy middle somewhere, right in the middle. Like, what are the things that are being talked about in terms of, say, I don't know, different models of sovereignty, different models of state that there are? Because there's a whole kind of larder full of choices to choose from. We just need to look around the Pacific to see the various different types of state there are. Like, what does a compromise look like?
Well, it's difficult to say, and for my own comments, I want to preface it by saying that, you know, any comments I make on possible options are my views. It's really hard because you have a situation where the people of Bougainville have voted, and it's such a resounding vote in favour of independence. And so their position is it must be independence. And I do understand that on the part of the PNG state, there are a whole range of issues that they need to consider. I mean, Papua New Guinea is a very diverse nation. It's made up of different cultures and different groups and hundreds of languages. And so for the government of PNG, it's not as simple, I don't think, as saying, well, we'll just give Bougainville independence and we'll all move on and be happy. PNG also needs to think about the fabric of the state, potential fragmentation, the possibility that, you know, other resource-rich provinces within PNG might start to agitate for independence. From my perspective, so my research at the ANU is really looking at the way in which the Bougainville Peace Agreement has been designed and the elements of that design that have worked well and those that haven't. And part of that is actually honing in on this post-referendum process, because when you look at the agreement, there's certain provisions that have, I guess, what you would call dependencies. For instance, in order for the constitutionalisation of arrangements to take place, there were certain requirements around weapons disposal. In order for the ABG, or the first Bougainville government, to be elected, again, there were dependencies around weapons disposal and constitutionalisation of arrangements. The challenge that we have is that for all of the detail contained in the peace agreement, there's very little on what needs to happen after the referendum has taken place. It just simply says that following the referendum result, the two governments will consult, and following those consultations, it will be put to Parliament, and any decision made, and by inference of that, it doesn't require that actually a decision be made, it's not prescribed, that decision will be communicated to the Bougainville Parliament. I think if there had been, as part of the peace agreement design process, I think some broader parameters around the negotiation and consultation process, that might help in terms of examining those types of options, Gordon, that you've been talking about. I think from my perspective, when you look at the Pacific region, there are examples that you can draw on. Obviously, the United States has free association pacts with Micronesian nations. New Zealand has some very innovative free association arrangements with the Cook Islands and Niue. I think that is something that could potentially work in the Bougainville context, but again, I want to say that I'm saying that from my perspective, based on my research, and I would never seek to in any way sort of predict what either government would think. But I think what we actually have here is a very unique opportunity to potentially create some kind of solution, some kind of mechanism, some kind of pact that is very unique in the PNG and Bougainville context. And that could take the form of a free association type model. But it doesn't need to be exactly the same as the US arrangements with Micronesia or the New Zealand arrangements with their Pacific partners. We really do have an opportunity here, I think, for the two governments to think really creatively about how they can address the independence aspirations of the Bougainville people while still maintaining some very close ties in relation to the PNG state. So a free association type model, I think, is definitely one option. Other options would include perhaps, you know, the negotiation of a roadmap for the future. I think we all need to recognise, despite the incredible aspirations of the Bougainville people, that Bougainville in its current form has very little capacity very little capability. It generates just 6% of the revenue that it needs at the moment just to operate as an autonomous government. And obviously, becoming an independent state gives rise to so many other obligations in terms of engagement with the international system, setting up defence mechanisms, foreign affairs, and all of those things. So, I think there's also the opportunity, and this is where the moderator can play, I think, an important role, to look at developing a roadmap. So perhaps not saying no to independence, but saying yes to independence, but not now, but as part of a roadmap to build the capability of Bougainville to be able to be successful in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I would love to explore that further on the role of the moderator. So Sir Jerry Mataparai was appointed as this moderator. He played a key role in the ceasefire negotiations back in the 1990s. He seems to have been a consensus pick between Bougainville and Papua New Guinea, which is a very good sign. So what is his role as moderator? What are the key issues that he's helping both sides resolve, and sort of what are the limits or how expansive is that role?
Yeah, look, I think, so the decision to engage a new moderator, and just to provide a bit of historical context, so there has previously been a moderator as part of the post-referendum processes, and that was former Prime Minister of Ireland, Bertie Ahern. And Bertie Ahern played a very critical role in the referendum as the chairman of the Bougainville Referendum Commission, and had built up a lot of goodwill between the two parties. But as a consequence of COVID and other things, with Mr. Ahern being based in Ireland, it became quite challenging for him to really meaningfully fulfil that role. So he stood aside from that, and there's been a lot of discussions. And it was in, I think, June this year that the two governments decided that they would like to go down the path of seeking a new moderator. So initially, the terms of reference for the moderator were what I would call quite narrow. So they were looking for someone who could assist the two governments to determine the appropriate mechanism and pathway for bringing the referendum result to Parliament, someone who could assist with the formulation of a joint consultation report, as well as someone who could perhaps assist the two governments in terms of creating awareness of the process. And I think, particularly amongst academics and commentators, there was some concern that terms of reference was really narrow, and that it wouldn't actually be able to help the two governments to move past what are very technical issues to look at more substantive issues around political settlement. So just recently, I think Sir Jerry was in Papua New Guinea about 3 weeks ago, and I believe he's travelling again next week. So, I mean, that's fantastic because, he's really, I guess, engaging quickly. I think there's an opportunity, and the two governments have agreed that as part of his terms of reference, that he can expand his role to look at assisting the two governments in examining options. And I know from the Bougainville side, and again, it's a shame we don't have James here.
We've got a solution.
Oh, good. I do know from the Bougainville side, when you talk about options, it does give rise to concern, and I can understand. They smell a rat. Like they've kind of been duped before, whether you look at the Bougainville Agreement of 1976, whether you look at aspects of the BPA that haven't been implemented. So when you talk about options, they naturally have suspicions. And I think someone like Sir Jerry, a former Governor-General, former Defence Force head in New Zealand, a former High Commissioner to London, and importantly, the commander of the peace monitoring mission that took place at the end of the conflict, I think that he will bring great credibility and will be able to, I guess, canvass different types of options. And the other point I would make is it's not just Sir Jerry. I mean, Sir Jerry will be there to act as the confidant of the two leaders, to work with them in confidence, to try and find solutions and options for a way forward. But he will also be supported by experts such as Gordon. I mean, not specifically Gordon, but people
Unless
like...
you know something I don't.
No, people like Gordon, who have, amazing knowledge and experience and expertise. So I'm actually, whilst initially the terms of reference for the moderator was probably considered to be quite narrow, I'm actually really optimistic. I think that we have really reached a very positive point in this process, and I've never met Sir Jerry, but everything I've read about him, he is the ideal candidate, and I think it's fantastic that the two governments were able to agree.
Also shows the importance of tenure. and relational capital.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you mentioned Sir Jerry has probably got a 25, 30-year lineage with Papua New Guinea and Bougainville, like a name recognition, a sense of being known and familiar
Absolutely.
with. And I mean, this is something that, that is one of the sort of abiding features of your career, Kevin, from having worked for 20 years in Papua New Guinea. And it's something that a drum that you've been politely beating when you've been here, which is the importance of time.
Yeah.
And the importance of relationships and the importance of getting to know people and not kind of rushing into things.
Yeah.
Now, you and I did work together in Bougainville for a few years, and we were used to coming up with creative solutions to unexpected problems. And we've come up with a creative solution to an unexpected problem here today, which is that James, who's still sort of marooned offline in some sense. He's online in the sense that he's typing us messages, but not able to get onto the Zoom link, has been typing furiously to my colleague Megan Sullivan, who's offside here. And James has a rich baritone. He's a wonderfully compelling speaker, and so Megan is going to sort of ventriloquize his words. But what we wanted to ask James about was this question that you posed, Camilla, this sort of Gordian knot in a way, which is that in order to become independent, you can have as good a referendum as you want, you can be as good a place as you want, you can be as united as you want. But what you actually need, the X factor, is recognition from a permanent member of the Security Council. And there's, you're the student of this, Kevin, but as you know, like there's been, it's narrowed down even more that it's the three Western members of the Security Council. So United States, United Kingdom, France. One of them needs to put their hand up and say, I'm for this. That's what happened to Timor-Leste, that's what happened to South Sudan as well. And what we wanted to ask James, and we'll give you a little break from this, you've been doing double time with this, is how's Bougainville going in trying to drum up this support? The president visited Washington, D.C., as you said, the president visited China, so I'm going to hand it over to Megan, who's going to sort of voice James's thing, and we'll all utter a silent prayer that we'll still get James online. But for now, over to you, Megan. Thank you, Megan.
So James observes, Bougainville already knows it will need recognition of 1 of 5 members of the Security Council, preferably the Western countries. We have quite a hope in the Western countries. With France, we were discovered by a French man and bear his name. With Britain, we are in the Commonwealth. We were separated from Solomon Islands by German-Anglo arrangements, and we are proud we were visited by Her Majesty in 1974. With the U.S., it was a major partner during World War II, and we are about birth of a new nation in areas where there's a lot of U.S. economic and security interest. So these are the powers we inherited, which Bougainville is part of today. Same languages, same democratic system, same Christian faith, and same systems of education. And with regard to the question about interest, do you want to go on to, we can talk about interest in, Chinese interest in Bougainville. So President Torrama did visit there last year, and the president also visited the US for more business networking. To the question of China, it's a hard one because as an autonomous government, Bougainville does not have full authority yet to manage our own international relations. It's still a PNG responsibility. Therefore, we cannot choose our international friends yet. That's why we hope we will be independent soon so we can manage our own international relations. The choice of China is a choice Bougainville can't freely make yet.
Great, and I mean, I think you can hear just from sort of even Megan ventriloquizing, what a kind of commanding speaker James is. He's able to sort of draw upon history and draw upon lineage as well to make it work. Camilla?
Yeah. So I'll ask, I think, our final question, and hopefully we can get an answer from you, Kevin, and perhaps another answer from James in this format. So looking ahead to the future, we've talked about these negotiations that are ongoing, and we know that, Papua New Guinea could table the referendum result with Parliament and vote on it, although they are not required to do so by the BPA. So if the Papua New Guinea Parliament does vote on the referendum and they do reject the result, there's been discussion of, could Bougainville unilaterally declare independence? And so if that were to happen, and you've got a unilateral declaration of independence, what would you expect Papua New Guinea to do next? How would it respond?
That's an interesting question. And it's not really an easy question to ask in the sense of it's hypothetical. Look, I think, firstly in relation to the UDI, as I said, and as we have discussed in terms of the way the international order works, in the absence of that international recognition, I don't see that the recognition of Bougainville independence would be forthcoming if it was undertaken as part of a UDI. I think for the government of PNG, I think they would be restrained. I think that they would continue to try to maintain dialogue and consultation. I don't think that there would be, I don't think, for instance, that the Papua New Guinea government would cut off funding. I don't think that they would seek to just sever ties and let Bougainville drift on its own. I think that they understand that they have an obligation to the Bougainville people. I do think, though, that if it does go down the path, and hopefully we don't get there, that there is a UDI, that would certainly elevate Bougainville's cause in the international community, and that could possibly lead to further sort of, I guess, international engagement and perhaps a flurry of activities amongst partners. But I think, if that was to happen, the government of Papua New Guinea would respond in a very restrained way. The reality is, Melanesian culture and Melanesian dialogue is very different to what we often experience in a Western context. I think that the Papua New Guinean government would continue to seek to engage, that they would try to continue to consult, and that they would continue to work with the Bougainvillians to find some form of a longer-term solution. I'm hopeful that we're not going to have a situation where it's just simply a independence yes or no question. As I said, it gets back to the issues that I was discussing before around the need for dialogue around a political settlement. And I would hope that, as we move forward, that what eventually goes to Parliament is something that provides next steps. Not necessarily like another peace agreement or a peace agreement Mark II, but like I said before, perhaps a roadmap that provides for continued engagement, for continued consultation, and for opportunities for Bougainville to continue to develop and grow in the future as it moves towards its general aspiration of independence. So I'm not really sure if that answers your question.
That was a very different...
The one point I would say is, people, since I've been in Washington, a lot of people, particularly meeting people from within the US government, the concern is there a likelihood of return of conflict? And I don't foresee any circumstance where Papua New Guinea would be aggressive towards Bougainville, and I don't see any situation or scenario at the moment where Bougainville would seek to be aggressive towards Papua New Guinea. So I think the likelihood of conflict recurrence, at least between Papua New Guinea and Bougainville, is relatively remote. My concern would be, because of the desire for independence, and I guess to a degree the impatience around that, if we got to that absolute stalemate where PNG just said no, Bougainville did the UDI but it wasn't recognised, there is then the potential, I guess, for some tensions to re-emerge in Bougainville amongst different Bougainville people around why independence didn't happen and so on. But really from a conflict perspective, I think, I don't foresee that we're going to see a return to the type of conflict and hostilities that we saw during the crisis.
Yeah, and that's what sort of recalling, because we think of the conflict in the Bougainville crisis, as it's kind of called. In Northern Ireland we called our problems the troubles. We've all got these kind of euphemisms for things. Some of the conflict was between Bougainville and Bougainvillians in Papua New Guinea, but there was also a large intra-Bougainvillian dimension to this as well. And as you were talking about, the unlikelihood of a return to conflict, it strikes me that there's a sort of that's a manifestly good thing.
Yeah.
But it also means that attention then doesn't get onto it for that reason. So someone we were at this week called it a frozen conflict or a frozen peace agreement. I thought it was a really good way to describe it. So I also want to thank some of the guests listening in online for a whole kind of host of questions that have been posed to Kevin. We're going to get to those in a couple of minutes. Megan will read them out, and James and Kevin will do their best to respond. I want to maybe ask you a question. Maybe like you're talking about options, so I'll give you a sort of options question.
Yep.
Would you like a question on bureaucratic mechanics, or would you like a question on geopolitics? And by the wonders of technology, I've just seen James Tanis appear on the screen with a kind of arc light behind him. So James, it's very nice to see you. Now it's the...
Gordon, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly fine. So this is our silent prayers were answered. So it's great to see you and great to hear you. And I know I speak for everyone in the room here and for everyone watching online that we're great to have you here contributing to it. I was going to ask Kevin a question, but I'm going to sort of pivot to that and talk to you and give you the floor. You've been listening in to us for the last sort of 35, 40 minutes while you've been kind of typing out answers and sort of struggling with the internet in Arawa. I'd love to get your reflections on sort of where Kevin's offered his reflections on where the process is, but I'd love to get your reflections, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that Bougainville will reach its aspiration of self-independence, let's say by 2027?
Gordon, it's a good question. Slow progress has been part of the process. There's still a lot of patience on both sides, and there's still flexibility for dialogue between the two governments. And experience has shown us that what may not be agreeable today can become agreeable few days down the line. So I'm still optimistic.
And what's your next few months look like, James? I mean, you're the international legate or legate, and I never know how to pronounce that word, like the envoy of Bougainville to kind of drum up interest. What is your kind of immediate time horizon look like in order to try to, this is part of your outreach work as well, of course, but what does the next sort of year look like for you as you go on? I know Camilla's got some questions that relate to the kind of geopolitics and sort of, the China dimension to this. I'll let her ask it, but I'd love to know what does the future, the immediate future look like for you? And I know there's a team in the Autonomous Region of Bougainville called the BMAT that's kind of wise men and women, sort of elders that are working on the issue. What does the future look like for you and your team?
I think the immediate future is more on the progress that has been made by the two governments to agree for a neutral moderator that will help the two governments continue with their discussions on how to settle the Bougainville issue. So I think the Bougainville government is coming close to the end of its term, and elections are just next year. But the most important thing for Bougainville is that at least a new process has begun. So at least there is something, at least there's a new development, at least there's an improvement on the dialogue, on the consultations, through the support of a moderator.
It's so great to have you with us, James. And I'll ask you another question about, we discussed earlier, Bougainville's efforts to get international support. And I read recently about how Bougainville is looking to become an associate member, I believe, of the Melanesian Spearhead Group. We've discussed in other times how there's a lot of regional support for New Caledonia's independence movement, but Bougainville is not quite there. So can you tell us more about what Bougainville is doing to seek support from the region as well, from the Pacific Islands?
We are taking very small steps at the moment. For example, under the current autonomy arrangements, we are supposed to have some elements of foreign affairs given to the ABG. We have already established a Directorate of International Trade and External Relations to make sure we use that element of autonomy so that we can start connecting internationally. And we have been taking cautious steps, at least one step at a time, in making sure that we establish our external relations in a way we do not sever relationships with our counterparts in Papua New Guinea. So it has been a slow process approach, and the best approach for us is to start with the region, start with a part of the world we live in, and then we can branch out into other parts later down the line.
Can I ask you, sort of probe a little bit more, James, on the sort of geopolitics of this? You give a very eloquent answer that you typed out, but I'll let you speak with your tongue rather than your fingers. You know, I mean, the whole Pacific Islands region is getting much more attention here in Washington, D.C., and there's a lot of, you know, geopolitics that inflects that attention both here but also in Beijing, and there's increased attention on all across the Pacific to that, including on Bougainville. You know, as you mentioned, you know, the president visited last year. I think it was Kevin mentioned that the president visited on an economic trip, you know, to China. There was a set of newspaper reporting about that recently. Can you talk a little bit about Bougainville's place, sort of within the kind of geopolitics of the present day Pacific? You must find that you're getting more and more kind of WhatsApp calls from various different people than you maybe would have been a few years ago.
Yeah, Gordon. I think as I wrote down in my notes, Bougainville is in a slightly difficult position because Bougainville is still an autonomous region, part of Papua New Guinea. So we do not have the sovereign powers and the freedom to choose our friends yet. So people coming into Bougainville are coming through the choices that Papua New Guinea is making. But in terms of the global powers, we have a history of being part of the world that discovered us, that colonized us, and that shared history together in the Second World War. So again, as I said, because Bougainville is an isolated island, unlike other struggling nations that have third countries supporting them, Bougainville has been fighting this struggle alone with no clear third country supporting us. So we have been treading this path with cautious steps. So I would not want to see Bougainville rushing off into the unknown too quickly, but remain close to the friends that we have shared history together, that has brought civilization to our society. And then from there, try to relate to the others who are part of the world in a slightly different way instead of just rushing. And this is just my personal opinion. I'm not giving out an official foreign policy of Bougainville because we are not yet there. We see other parts of the other struggling people who are a bit luckier than us. They have a strong international support. They have a voice in other countries. We have not been attending Melanesian Spearhead Group meetings, Pacific Islands Forum, while other struggling Melanesian peoples have been given the opportunity. but I think we will get there, one step at a time. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you, James. It's a delicate diplomatic dance. I'm gonna sort of pause here, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to our colleague Megan, who's been curating some of the questions that we've received, and Megan will tell us who the person who's asking the question, and if there's someone, if it's directed to you, James, or to you, Kevin, we'll do that. But let's maybe take one question and then from your choice, Megan. Thank you.
Yes, so following on to the discussion we were just having, Isaiah Garner asks, should other nations stay on the sidelines while talks continue between Bougainville and PNG, or is there a role for outside nations to play in supporting Bougainville's quest for independence?
Okay, that sounds like a question for you, James.
I think my immediate response would be that many countries, including the United Nations, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and all other countries have contributed to the Bougainville peace process, and we have signatories to the peace agreement. I think it's time they talked and voiced out their concerns, because it seems that the two governments need a little bit nudging from all sides to make sure we complete the process within this generation. One of the worries that I have is that the generation that started the conflict is dying out, and I might be one of the last survivors. So I would not want my children and the next generation to inherit an unresolved conflict. And also the world politics is changing. There are wars happening in other parts of the world, so we have no choice. We must round up this process and complete it before the world interest and priorities change.
Yeah, it's an interesting example of kind of,
Hello?
yeah, no, we can hear you, of kind of timing. I mean, it's sort of like, it's the sort of variation of like, we've got all the watches and you've got all the time, but it's a different set of timetables that people are working on. And like James mentions, the election to a President Ismail Turama, has the right to run again in 2025, but it's a two-term presidency. And the next Papua New Guinea parliamentary elections are in 2027. That's right. And often electioneering sort of begins round about now. So, there's not a lot of time to make things move with, and James mentioning the variable attention that we all have on places.
Yeah. Should we go to another?
Yeah. Well, let's go for another question.
Yeah, so on that note, Paul Rowland asks, given the high support for independence, what kind of pressure does next year's looming Bougainville election put on the new moderator?
And just for please, James.
Yes, Lauren and Megan. I think one of the key elements of the process is continuity, to make sure there is a continued activity. Because a change of government on Bougainville in Papua New Guinea is just a change of government and leadership. Otherwise, the problem, the Bougainville situation will continue to exist. So the important element is to ensure that dialogue and consultation and negotiations continue and should not be given a break simply because of a change of government.
Yeah, absolutely.
If not driven by politicians, let the officials drive it. The officials who won't be part of the elections.
Yeah, I agree with you, James. I think that the moderator will obviously be cognizant of the political electoral cycle, both in Bougainville and PNG. But this is an issue that transcends politics, and as you also say, and having had the honour to work with you and to work with the Papua New Guinean government, at an administrative level, it doesn't really matter what the political cycle is, that dialogue will continue. I think for the moderator, he doesn't need to feel pressured that there's an election coming next year. His role is to really focus on supporting dialogue and consultation at the senior political level to try and find a way forward, regardless of when the next election might be.
Yeah, Bougainville is being handled by five or six prime ministers,
Yep.
and it's the same activity as usual.
Yep.
And that is one of the things that has made the process survive almost to 36 or 35 years now, and becoming one of the longest processes in the world.
So James,
At least something should be happening somewhere at all levels of society. If the leaders are busy, then the moderator should be talking to the people. If the people are busy, talk to the leaders. This is an holistic approach.
So James, I wanted to also ask you, cognizant of the time, there's one sort of aspect of this that we haven't touched on yet, which is Panguna Mine, which was, of course, a point of conflict during the crisis. Are there any, how does that stand now? What are the plans to, either reopen Panguna, or I know there are some concerns about doing that as well, but would you like to touch on that?
I can just briefly make some observation on Panguna. I'm a resident down the tailings of the Panguna mine. Actually, the worst part. I live there, and the first observation that I want to share is that there's been a decision by the landowners and the Bougainville government to reopen Panguna, but at the same time, currently there's a human rights impact assessment process going on, and there are also a group of Bougainvillean landowners and leaders who have taken Rio Tinto to court. So it's really a difficult situation at the moment. There is no linear approach. There is no single line, single pathway. So it looks like a web of activities. So in my view, there's a desire to open it, but the actual operation may take a few more years.
Thank you so much, James. That's really great to know about. And for our listeners, some context, the Panguna mine caused a lot of environmental damage, and so recently landowners have tried to take the mining company to court to try to get a settlement for compensation for that. Should we turn it over to the...
Yeah, and we've got sort of, there's also a huge financial aspect to this as well. And there's $60 billion worth of resources that are in the mine. And as James mentioned, there's the mine was one of the triggering events for the crisis itself. And then the catch-22 is that the resources that are in the mine are potentially the Bougainville's economic salvation kind of going forward. I want to sort of ask, maybe touch on the issue of officials that James mentioned, and you've talked about it too in relation to kind of officials working on things and people working on things. And it's a question of kind of bureaucratic mechanics in a way. I mean, I am from a country, or a place, Northern Ireland, where I voted in 2 referendums. I voted in the Good Friday Agreement referendum, which was in large part shepherded by a moderator from the United States, Senator George Mitchell. But I also voted in the Brexit referendum as well, where the UK voted to separate from the European Union. Now, obviously, it's not the same. It's not oranges and oranges, but it's not apples and oranges either when it comes to kind of questions of separation and officials working on matters. Because, as James said, the leaders need to discuss, the leaders need to meet, but ultimately, in all systems, it is the sort of officials and bureaucrats that have to kind of go away and scurry away to do the work. Whatever the arrangement looks like, or even the idea of generating different options, that's quite a lot of kind of bureaucratic horsepower that is required in order to to sort of type out words and send them around. The work of bureaucracy. Does Sir Jerry, as moderator, have a bureaucratic team behind him that can do the work to assist him. And I'd love to get both your comments on that, but also on Bougainville and Papua New Guinean officials. Is there enough of them able to sort of do this kind of complicated separation work or renegotiation work or recommittal work, whatever you want to describe it? I'd love to get sort of, it's a boring topic, but in some ways, but it's actually kind of important because you were one of those people that were behind the scenes, Kevin, helping make the referendum happen, and the work, the work and support that you gave was instrumental in that. This is a much bigger kettle of fish, and I'd love to get maybe I'll start with you to talk about kind of the bureaucratic horsepower that there is, both for the moderator and for the everyday work of government. And James is like, well, the politicians are going to happen, so officials need to get to work. Okay, well, what about those officials? And I'd love to get your responses on that, and then we'll take a few more questions from the floor.
Sure. I mean, look, in relation to the moderator, and James would probably be better placed to talk about that because I haven't been as closely involved in the process, but my understanding is that he's being engaged by the United Nations and that there will be a broader package of support to assist the moderator in terms of undertaking his role in continuing consultation and dialogue between the two leaders. So I would expect that there would be, as I think I mentioned before, experts and others who would be able to support him in his role. I think when you look at horsepower and, the first thing I would say is that, I worked in Bougainville directly in the public service for 2 years, and whilst it is there are incredible capacity limitations and issues around capability, the one thing that I could never question is the drive and the desire to do the work and to make some progress. But that obviously presents challenges. I think, within Bougainville, it's been difficult to attract outside public servants to go in. So there's really, quite a significant focus on building capability and capacity of existing public servants. But particularly when you're looking at complex processes such as the transfer of powers and functions, that does present, quite significant, problems and challenges. At the national government level, there are equal capacity issues. I mean, it's different scales and it's different levels. And I think, getting back to what James was saying, as being sort of, one of the last of his generation who holds that knowledge, part of the issue, I think, at the national government level is, the BPA was signed 23 years ago. This is a conflict that has its origins 30 plus years ago. And as a consequence, the technical and detailed and legal understanding around the provisions of the peace agreement and what's required has been lost over time to some degree. And I think that's also been a challenge in terms of the national government and the national government officials, I should say, the public service, understanding what their role should be and their obligations in supporting Bougainville, both in relation to autonomy, but particularly now in relation to the post-referendum process. So it's a challenge, is, I guess, the short answer.
Yeah, I mean, the passage of time, James, and its impact on that. I mean, I think of so many of the people that I worked with in Bougainville. I think of the former late Vice President of Bougainville, Honourable Joseph Watowi, someone who had one of those knowledges of the peace agreement. He was one of the many people that, along with public servants, that were struck down during the COVID period in Bougainville. Bougainville lost a lot of very senior officials during that time, and as James said, he's certainly not the last man standing, but he's of that generation. So James, I'd love to get your thoughts on just, the role of officials here and the work they have to do. I mean, I note that Bougainville recently launched its latest corporate plan, which is being styled as a roadmap, for independence. I'd love to get your thinking on kind of the role of officials and sort of the behind-the-scenes people that we need in all our sense to do this work. We're able to do this event because there's lots of behind-the-scenes people behind us that make it look easy for us, and we're really, really grateful for them. But I'd love to get your views on officials and their role, and then we'll turn to some questions from Megan.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. I think to understand the Bougainville situation with the officials, we need to look at the two things that Bougainville officials and leaders try to juggle every day. The first one is the everyday livelihood of Bougainvillians. That means service delivery, development, and business. Life needs to continue. Life needs to continue improving. And while on the other hand, we have the Bougainville political issue, the independence issue that we wanted to be achieved. So in an everyday activity, public servants will find themselves trying to maintain livelihood, the delivery of goods and services, government service to the people, trying to make a difference. And also, on one hand, trying to make sure the negotiation process, the peace process continues, because if there is no dividend, peace dividend, we can lose the support of the population. And if we lose the political focus on independence, we might have a dissatisfied factions that can disrupt the progress that we have, small progress that we have made in development and service delivery. So that is the kind of juggling that public servants are faced up to do with every day. And of course, the resources are scarce. Funding is never on time. The constitutionally guaranteed financial support by the Papua New Guinea government is never on time, and when it comes, it is never enough. So it's a really difficult situation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Camilla and I visited Bougainville last August, and I mean, a couple of things certainly struck me. I think they struck you as well, which was that, first of all, the Bougainville, when we went in to visit the offices of the Bougainville government, you could hear the chug of the generator because there was no electricity there, and then the electricity kind of ran out of chug. But also there was lots of people still in their offices doing their work, and I think that's kind of an important thing for you to remind us of, James, which is when we're in kind of forums like this, we kind of focused intensely on kind of big issues around constitutionalism and kind of the mechanics of a peace agreement. But many Bougainvillians are who are working the public service, are using their salaries in order to care for their kith and kin, and sort of show up to work every day in the most difficult of circumstances. So I think it's really worth, I'm glad to on a sort of underline and put in yellow highlight what you said there. So Megan.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions on China that have many thumbs up, so we can turn to those now. So obviously acknowledging that Bougainville doesn't yet have, full control over its international relations, but as it's thinking about, partners, does China's more aggressive posture towards Taiwan and the Philippines have any impact on Bougainville? And then someone else is asking about fears of falling into a credit trap with China, and what can Bougainville do to kind of protect itself from economic dependency?
Okay, these are two tough questions. Let's see how our very adroit kind of diplomats handle them. Why don't you go first, Kevin, and then I'll ask James. Sort of the China question.
Yeah, look,
China questions.
I mean, there are a number of issues, I think, with China in relation to Bougainville, as James said, and you mentioned Gordon earlier. I mean, there are tremendous economic opportunities, and the President visited China last year and met with a number of sort of captains of industry to explore opportunities. I think in terms of when you talk about the debt trap, I think that is something that is potentially a concern, because I think, Bougainville really has this desire to move forward, to develop and grow, and to do that there needs to be funding sources, and there needs to be mechanisms to help support that. that's why I think that in terms of looking at a way forward, in terms of the next steps and enabling independence and a political settlement, it needs to be managed carefully with a roadmap. I don't really want to comment on China, good or bad. I think China plays an important role in the region, and there's a place. But I do think, certainly from the Bougainville perspective, as a young emerging nation, there will be a need to think carefully about where they source financing from and how that financing is, particularly if it does come tied to debts and loans, and that has the potential to set Bougainville up to be, a heavily indebted small nation.
Which, of course, is the story of Papua New Guinea and Chinese debt as well. So.
Yeah, and Tonga, I think, which is 25% of the national budget now.
Yeah. James, over to you.
James, yeah.
Thank you. As I said, China is a difficult question for Bougainville because in the first place, Bougainville doesn't have the capacity to choose its own friends. And the second observation that I want to make is that China is also a difficult country because when I look around the world, I see no country that is immune from China. And Bougainville is just a small place. But in Bougainville, at the leadership level, what is clear to us is that we are a society where we inherited the religions, the education system, the official language and civilization from the West. And China is also, the Chinese are not new to Bougainville. They came at the same time with the colonizers, but they came in as traders. And for now, my personal opinion is that we do need a relationship with China, but it is up to the leadership and the government to make choices as to what we need from China and what we do not need from them. This is not a whole package approach, but I wish Bougainville will soon become independent and have that opportunity to choose its own friends and maintain those friends in the way that is good for Bougainville. At the moment, we are just at the receiving end of bilateral relations that Papua New Guinea has. Gordon?
Yep. We can hear you. Thank you, James, for that. Megan?
Yeah, so we have an anonymous question asking, how much popular support is there in PNG for Bougainville's independence? And are there any efforts or interests within PNG to further hinder progress towards independence?
That's a great question. Thank you, Mr. or Ms. Anonymous. That's a very good one. How much were Papua New Guineans speaking about Bougainville? I'll ask you that first, James. You've got family, obviously, in Bougainville, but I know you have children in various parts of Papua New Guinea as well. They were been studying in Papua New Guinea as well. So you get to take the pulse in your travels as well. Among I hesitate to use the phrase the ordinary people, but people that are not in these serried diplomatic ranks. How much support is there for Bougainville independence within the average person from Morobe or Hela or Peake or New Ireland?
Yes, it's a very good question. But one of the ways to look at the Bougainville independence aspiration is that Bougainville is not trying to be independent from a colonial master, but it is trying to become an independent country from relatives. So in a nutshell, what is important for Bougainville and Papua New Guinea is relationship. And on the question of what other Papua New Guineans think of Bougainville, it is also a difficult question because an average Papua New Guinean have not felt the pain and the struggles that Bougainvilleans had to go through before they started to fight for independence. So a non-Bougainvillean will never understand the Bougainville aspiration for independence fully. That is why there might be a need for public awareness and public consultation, because at the end of the day, even if Bougainville becomes independent, Bougainville will still share the same boundaries with Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea will still be the bigger country that will provide bigger market for Bougainville. So it all boils down to relationships, because in my view, I've always argued, if you look at independence at the structural level, it's not about separation. It's actually about redefining a relationship at a different level.
Kevin, sort of, you've been based for a long time in Port Moresby.
Yeah.
So what's the take there?
Look, I mean, I agree with what you said, James, in the sense of the context of the conflict and the origins of the conflict and the history. There are a lot of Papua New Guineans who weren't even born, when you look at how young the population is, who weren't even born when the crisis began, and they don't have that context. And so I think, certainly talking amongst my Papua New Guinean friends, at a general level, I think there's a great deal of sympathy for Bougainville's desire to be independent. I agree with James that there isn't necessarily the awareness, and I totally agree with James that it's impossible for for a Papua New Guinean to really truly understand what Bougainville went through, not just in relation to the crisis, but in the lead up to the crisis, the issues around independence when Papua New Guinea gained its own independence in 1975. So it's hard to say, it's hard to measure. But I would say that of the people that I spoke to over my many years in Port Moresby and working on Bougainville issues, there was a higher degree of sympathy towards independence than not. There's certainly hard-line positions on both sides, but I agree with all of your points, James. It's not really as much what do Papua New Guineans think. I think it's a matter of, do Papua New Guineans understand what the drivers are here, why Bougainville is so determined to go and chart its own path forward.
It's interesting to kind of chart the evolution of ideas. I mean, James spoke about, the idea of like doing consultations and awareness among Papua New Guineans about this. I spent, a little bit in my time in Bougainville, kind of 2016 to 2019. That was an idea that was already on the table then, which is sort of a really important one. So the other thing that just struck me as you were talking was about, and it chimes back to something you said about how Bougainville is one of the most peaceable places presently in Papua New Guinea. There is no conflict in Bougainville. It's a place where, I always felt extremely comfortable, walking up and down the street. In Bougainville, like my family came to visit me in Bougainville, like our two children who were then very young were able to kind of wander around with no problem at all. And you contrast that with sort of elsewhere in Papua New Guinea where levels of violence appear to be escalating and increasing. Like every day, when we think of intergroup fighting in the highlands, we think of, what the Professor Miranda Forsyth at the Australian National University calls this wildfire of sorcery accusation-related violence that goes on as well. So I want to maybe ask, a sort of broader question beyond Bougainville, and then what we'll do is we'll do that, and then we'll ask you two gentlemen to kind of maybe provide your kind of closing remarks on it, which is, what's your sense of where Papua New Guinea is? A lot of the focus of this last hour and a quarter has been about Bougainville and where Bougainville is going and that, but what's your sense of the trajectory of Papua New Guinea from here? I mean, it's puncturing and penetrating our consciousness here in Washington, D.C. more and more often, and often the headlines aren't good. There was tribal fighting in Hela, in Enga. There's all these untold stories that never make it into the newspapers. James, what's your sense of Papua New Guinea as a kind of as an entity? Like, it's about to celebrate its 50th anniversary of independence. Over to you.
Gordon, my observation is very, very simple. On Bougainville, we it doesn't mean that there is no violence. There is violence, but the chiefs and leaders are always one step ahead to make sure they resolve it before it becomes big. And there's a reason for it. You only need to see one war and know how painful it is. That will make you be cautious to avoid smaller conflicts. As for our Papua New Guinean friends, I feel sorry because they have not seen a real war yet. They have not fought with the state. Yet. They have never been put under a blockade yet. They have not experienced a full-scale war yet. And I do hear some few provinces that talk about autonomy, and some might even call for independence. So the question that comes to my mind each time is that, are they willing to fight another war? Are they ready to go through the same struggles we did? So the big difference in Bougainville is that we have come out of a very bad war that cost more than 20,000 lives. We do not want to take any chance. That's why we are always quick to resolve any small conflicts that might lead to a bigger conflict. On the Papua New Guinea side, their people and their leaders have not seen a real war yet. My view is that the leaders and Papua New Guineans will take heed until they see a real war being fought on the Papua New Guinean mainland soil against the government. Wars are wars, and they are all bad. The main difference is that Bougainville has seen one, and we do not want to take any chances. On the other side, they have not seen one, so they are playing with fire. Gordon, that's my take.
Thank you, James. I think it's worth, it's like all your observations, it's worth reflecting on, because I think what you see is different to what I see in Bougainville, and this kind of strength of the society that is underneath the government. I wrote a book on Bougainville. I wrote about it, Travels with a former, he's a friend of mine, he's a former combatant. I think he's actually listening in tonight, a guy called Eddie Mohin, and he was a commander former commander in the BRA, the Bougainville Revolutionary Army. He doesn't wear a uniform. He's not a member of the police, but yet when there was any problems in Bougainville, it was people like these kind of leaders that James are talking about. They don't necessarily wear the signifiers of state that we think they are, that are kind of calming it in. And sometimes we never give credit enough to the dogs that don't bark. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. But Kevin, Papua New Guinea is about to celebrate its 50th birthday next year. What's your kind of take on the kind of trajectory of the place? Because a lot of the news is not crash hot.
No, it's not. And I think, we've seen some really disturbing cases, particularly in the highlands, of tribal violence, going beyond what we would consider traditional tribal violence into really quite horrific incidences of violence, particularly against women, but, increasingly involving high-powered weapons. There's the politics of money in terms of, particularly the resource-rich provinces and how that's now manifesting in terms of competition. I think it's easy when you look at Papua New Guinea and you look at all the headlines to be pessimistic, because, rarely do you have a day where there's not a report of a murder or an atrocity on the front page. But I'm actually a little bit more optimistic. I do think, as you said, PNG will turn 50 next year, the 50th anniversary of independence. Certainly there are growing pains, certainly there are challenges. There's challenges in terms of governance. But I think what James said in relation to Bougainville applies equally in terms of PNG, obviously putting aside the issues you talked about, James, in terms of Bougainville's experience of having gone through war and conflict. But I think, it's really that grassroots leadership that plays a role in terms of, reconciliation, building healing, and so on. Look, I think PNG isn't isolated from the rest of the world. It suffers many of the problems that other parts of the world do through transnational crime and so on. But it's an emerging young country in the Pacific. What I would say is that the people I worked with, particularly at the public service level, have huge commitment and a huge desire to do great things in PNG and in terms of supporting Bougainville. So that's probably a cop-out answer in a way, I guess. But
no, I think it's a good answer because it reminds us that PNG is a resourceful nation, but perhaps the greatest resource it has is its people.
Absolutely.
I want to sort of give a plug for two plugs for things. One, we're about to publish a special report which offers some optimistic lenses on a place which often gets into headlines for the wrong reasons, which is Hela province in Papua New Guinea. My colleague Camilla has been instrumental in helping shepherd that to its end. And Camilla herself is also writing a special report, which is our flagship publication on independence movements in Pacific. So stay tuned for that. We'll be grilling you about that going forward. So we've got about a minute each to go. Thank you to everyone who's provided the questions. I'll turn it over to you both. You've got the clock in front of you. You see it ticking. Yep. Love you to just get your final observations, then we'll wrap it up. And thank you everyone for staying with us during this time. Kevin.
Yeah, look, I think we're at a pretty critical point in terms of the peace process. I think that the appointment of the moderator through Sujeri presents huge opportunities, and I think it really is kind of a breakthrough in terms of the opportunity to talk about actual models and arrangements that can support independence in the longer term. So I think there is this perception that the Bougainville, the post-referendum process is taking a long time, but let's remember, it took us 5 years to negotiate the Bougainville Peace Agreement. I don't think we should be rushed. I think that the critical issue is to set Bougainville up to succeed in the future.
Great, very succinct. James, I'll give you the final word and I'll make some closing comments, then we'll wrap up. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, listeners. My final word is that the Bougainville peace process is held on and it will continue to progress, because there are a few elements that keep it together. One is the strength of the people, the resilience of the society. The second is the commitment by the two governments. And for the Bougainville side is the ongoing hope that there will be independence for Bougainville. It took us one small sentence in the peace agreement to make sure we lay down our arms and come onto the negotiating table. And that clause is a clause that said in the referendum there shall be a separate choice for independence for Bougainville. And as long as the independence hope is kept alive, as far as Bougainville is concerned, we will continue to remain on the process and continue to take turns together with the government of Papua New Guinea. And the independence agenda is now appearing on the table, not for the first time, but it is rather a joint outcome of the two governments. So it is not a negotiating position now for Bougainville, but the outcome is jointly owned, and they have a joint responsibility to continue implementing the peace process to the last of it. And that the last of it is the ratification. And in a way, symbolically, Gordon and others, it's a symbolic. The process started with the New Zealand intervention. It's coming to its close with the New Zealand moderator. So it might be a good omen. That's a nice arc to close. That's a nice arc to close it on. Thank you for your perseverance with us, James, and thank you to everyone who's been watching online on behalf of us all. Stay tuned for what our next event will be. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.